Good afternoon, everyone. Looks like we've got people slowly coming in, so we're going to give folks about 3 or 4 more minutes to join. Welcome, everyone, today. Just sit tight, get that last drink of water or some coffee, and we will begin at 12:03 just to give everyone enough time to come in. For those of you who are just joining, we're just waiting just a few more moments, letting everyone join in. Thank you all so much for telling us where you're from in the chat. I love that. I'm seeing folks from Ohio, California. So good morning to all of you all across the country and our territories. We'll begin at 12:03 p.m. Eastern time. So just sit tight. We'll be right with you. All right, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Rachel Gibson, and I am one of our center directors here at the National Center for Victims of Crime. I work at our Center for Victim Service Professionals, where we support anyone who will help a victim along their journey, whether they are advocates, law enforcement, bankers, financial service folks, anyone who works with victims. So welcome on behalf of the National Center. A few housekeeping things to note before we begin. First, you are in a webinar titled Drivers of Repeat Fraud Victimization and Why We Need to Change the Narrative. We have 2 phenomenal presenters with us today, Kathy Stokes and Robert Massio. I will introduce them a little bit later, but so delighted to have them. This webinar is being recorded. So if you have any privacy concerns, please don't use the chat, use the Q&A, but you will receive a copy of this recording, a PDF of the PowerPoint, subsequent materials, and an evaluation in the coming weeks. So please look out for that. You should be able to hear me, but I should not be able to hear you. So if you cannot hear me, please reach out to Cameron Saylor and we can help you get your audio figured out, because we want you to be able to have this great information. We unfortunately are not able to give out certificates. There's a lot of you and one of me. So if there are some ways in which we can support you to let your folks know, you can reach out to me, but certificates are, we're not able to do that. For those of you who would like a live transcription of what's happening today, you can click that at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to have that as well. For questions, we're going to take questions at the end of our presentation today, but if you have any good questions, go ahead and put that in the Q&A area. That will be where we'll take our questions. We ask you not to put them in the chat because the chat is consistently moving and we may miss those. So please, please, please utilize our Q&A area. And now for our introduction of our speakers. Kathy Stokes is a nationally recognized leader in the consumer fraud arena. She's the Director of Fraud Prevention Programs with AARP. In this role, Kathy leads AARP's social mission work to educate older adults on the risks that fraud represents to their financial security. She currently serves on the advisory council to the board of International Association of Financial Crimes Investigators and is also on an advisory council to a committee of the North American Securities Administrators Association. Robert Massio is director, and just got to move my screen over. He's one of the directors of Investor Education Outreach for the Finra Foundation. In this capacity, he cultivates and manages programs to protect consumers from investment and other financial frauds. Mr. Massio also facilitates Finra's Investor Issues Committee. Mr. Massio got his MBA from Florida State University and undergraduate degree from Salisbury University. So at this point, we're going to start off with our first question. This is where you all can interact with us. So Cameron, if we can launch that poll, perfect. Tell us what type of work you do. And we'll give folks about a minute or so to answer that. And if you don't see your profession represented, go ahead and put that in the chat. Muted myself. Cameron, can we go ahead and display those results? Awesome. So we've got a large representation from victim advocacy, legal court professionals, older adults. I see some APS. I always forget to put my APS friends on here, but I appreciate the work that you all do. So thank you all for joining. We've got some law enforcement, banking and financial services. I've got legal advocates, couple of legal advocates, wonderful, wonderful, social worker. So we are all represented here today. So all of your work, thank you all so much for the work you do on behalf of victims of crime and fraud victims. And I will now turn it over to Kathy and Rob.
Great, well, thank you all so much. If you catch me glancing off over into the abyss over here, I have the chat up on my other screen, so I'm not looking out the window. I'm trying to stay informed with everything that you all are talking about here in the chat and the Q&A. But as Rachel mentioned, I'm Rob Massio. Kathy's here with me. We're going to talk to you all about some of the drivers of repeat fraud victimization and why it's so important for us to choose the right words and what we can do to possibly change the narrative when we talk about victims of financial fraud. But before we dig into that, we thought it would be helpful just to kind of give a little bit of background for those of you that might not be aware about the organizations that we work for. So I'll start and then I'll pass it over to Kathy. I work for FINRA, and FINRA is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. We're a private, not-for-profit organization put in place by Congress and were overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission to make sure that we are doing the job that we were put in place to do. With all that being said, we are not a government agency, but we are overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And we were put in place to regulate the brokerage industry. So we regulate brokerage firms, we regulate employees of those brokerage firms, and we go about that through a variety of different channels. We write and enforce rules. We do look for educational opportunities to inform consumers, to inform people within the industry. And we also can take disciplinary action when individuals violate the rules, the securities rules that are put in place. Now, I also work for the Finra Foundation, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of FINRA. And the goal of the foundation is to improve financial literacy and inclusion for all Americans. And the program that I specifically work on is the Investor Protection Campaign, which anybody who's been on some of these webinars in the past, you might have seen me. We focus on trying to provide advocates and individuals with the tools and the resources to be able to identify financial fraud and exploitation and how to respond when there are instances of fraud or exploitation. So with that being said, I'll let Kathy explain a little bit about the company she works for, in case you don't know who or what AARP is.
Thank you, Rob. So Rob talked about FINRA sort of being in two parts, and I would say AARP is in three. We have a foundation, the AARP Foundation, that does all of the great charitable work that involves lifting people up economically, older adults. And then we have a for-profit called AARP Services Incorporated, and they're responsible for getting all the great benefits for our about 38 million members. And in the middle of all that is what we call the AARP Enterprise. And that's where all of our social mission work comes in. So we're doing everything that we can to protect the financial security, in this case, of adults 50 and over, but really it does apply to all of us of any age. We have a Fraud Watch Network, and I'll share some information about that at the end of the presentation. But you all may have already worked with AARP folks across the country. We have 53 state offices, and about 43 of them, I think, have very active fraud prevention programming where they go out into community or do something virtually during this whole COVID thing. So you may have already partnered with them, but if you haven't and you want to meet folks from the AARP state office in your area, let me know and I'll make a connection.
Perfect. All right, with that background kind of covered about who we are, we'll dig straight in here. So the first study, we're going to go through a couple different studies that we've worked on. But this is the first one. It's addressing the challenges of chronic fraud victimization. And if you're interested in looking at the research brief and some of the additional content related to this study, one place you can go to download it is the Finra Foundation website. So finrafoundation.org, and it's a section called the Knowledge We Share. You can get the whole report there, and if you want some more details or anything along those lines. So but we're going to do our best to give you some of those high-level clip notes. So the first question is, why even study chronic victimization? Well, there's a few reasons that we decided that this is something important to do. And again, this was a project that FINRA Foundation worked on with AARP. We know that chronic fraud victimization, it's often over-experienced. A lot of people are experiencing it, but it's understudied. We don't know that much about some of those drivers and what causes an individual to be chronically victimized. So going through this project, we wanted to be able to define what some of those drivers were and understand really why is an individual chronically victimized by different types of frauds. Getting all that information, we then wanted to figure out what kind of intervention strategies could we potentially put in place. And is there any way that we can develop consumer education content, again, to help disrupt that cycle of chronic fraud victimization? Now, before we go any further, we have another poll for you. So Cameron, if you wouldn't mind launching the next poll, we just want to get some of your all's take on fraud victimization. So the poll is, what age group do you think is most targeted by scams? Give you just a few moments here to respond. It's just a bunch of numbers, so not a whole lot of reading. Pick the age bracket you think is the group that is most targeted by scams. And Cameron, once we I guess get critical mass, we can go ahead and share it whenever that is. Take a moment, quickly give us your best estimate, your best guess. All right.
So Rob, let's take a look at this. I really wanted to ask this question because you may be very surprised to know that younger adults experience fraud and losses related to scams more often than older adults. So every category below 55 is targeted and they lose money more often. That's a big surprise to a lot of people. I think a lot of people assume that fraud targets older adults because they are in cognitive decline and they're not tech savvy. And for so many of them, that couldn't be further from the case. So we seek to dispel these kind of myths. The catch, though, is if you're an older adult and you lose money to a fraud, you lose so much more. And it stands to reason. If you're in that age category, you've probably saved for retirement, you have the Social Security check, maybe a pension, maybe housing, wealth, life insurance, whatever it is. The older generations are sitting on most of the wealth in this country. So when the scammer hits on an older victim, they just, they can financially destroy them. So I think it's a fascinating little test here. And I think we're going to use this poll in future discussions, right, Rob?
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's dig right in. So just to define a little bit about what chronic fraud victimization is, before we get into the details of the studies and some of the drivers. Chronic fraud victimization, we've defined it as an individual who is repeatedly victimized by the same type of scam. So same scam over and over again, that would be considered a chronic fraud victim. But so would an individual who has been victimized by multiple different scams. So both of those are what we're using as our definition of a chronic fraud victim. So it could be somebody repeatedly targeted by the same type of scam, and those that are targeted by multiple different types of scams.
So when we worked with a consulting company called Heart and Mind Strategies, real big brains over there, and they were able to bring to this whole process a behavioral model that actually is borrowed from the marketing industry, in which it's a trigger, a motivation, and an ability that drives behavior. In marketing, you can see how that would work. And in fraud, what we're talking about is a trigger that yields an emotional response. That's very important because it's in that emotional response where we get caught up in the scam. A motivation in the target that drives the behavior, and we'll talk a lot about that. And that the target has the ability to access funds or otherwise respond to the perpetrator. So that was the behavioral model. And what we laid over top of that was situational factors that allows room for the scam event. What are some of those situational factors? We found they are circumstantial, cognitive, and also characteristics of the victim. So in circumstantial, we see a lot of it around social isolation, especially during the pandemic, and those really big, difficult life moments, like the loss of a spouse, the loss of a job, other life stressors. And cognitive, this is a really important point to make as well. Some of it's about the biases that we have, the way we think, the shortcuts we have that sometimes lead us down in the wrong direction when we respond to a stimulus. But a lot of people also assume that the cognitive issue with older adults is that it's cognitive decline. And I can tell you that it plays a role sometimes, absolutely, but nowhere near is that always the case. And then when you look at the characteristics of particular victims, it may be a feeling like a lack of a sense of purpose or loneliness, and importantly, not knowing a whole lot about scams and fraud.
So we'll dig a little more into some of the triggers, motivations, and ability section of the wheel that we'll show you in a minute. So the trigger, that's going to be some sort of mechanism that puts this whole thing into motion. So it could be an urgent call for help. It could be the phone call that an individual receives that prompts the series of transactions. It could be a romantic seduction, the promise of a windfall. Those are some of the triggers that could occur. Now, the motivation section, that's going to be focusing on really the individual's motivational needs and what they're trying to fulfill. It could be that they're looking to come across as helpful, or they're trying to regain a sense of control, or the need to feel loved or wanted or important. Those are some of the motivational factors that can often play into this chronic fraud victimization cycle. And then the last piece is the ability. And that can be, really boiled down to the individual's ability to access funds, access a certain type of information to move forward with the perpetrator's ask.
So let's take an example and run through this model. So let's say the situational factor is a widow, recent loss of a spouse. The trigger, all too often these days, is an online romance scam. So the perpetrator makes that victim believe in a relationship that isn't real. So it's romantic seduction, and the need is to be loved, to be needed in your time where you're, recently lost the most important person in your life, and then the ability, having access to bank accounts, other financial accounts.
Perfect. Now let's look at it in another visual here. I know people learn from different ways and different mechanisms. This wheel kind of helps me put it all together. So again, we're starting with the situational factors, that dysfunction that disrupts an individual's judgment. Again, it could be the loss of a spouse. In some cases, it could be cognition. Then you're met with the trigger. So that's the actual fraud attempt, that specific catalyst that elicits some sort of a response, an emotional response. Again, that phone call, that email that an individual receives, the thought of getting a large windfall of money. Then we're met with the motivation section. Again, that core value to be needed, that's going to drive their behavior. So that motivational need that they're looking to try and fulfill. And then lastly, ability, access to funds, being able to respond to the perpetrator's ask. So those are the drivers of chronic fraud victimization that we've found going through this study. So what can we do to disrupt? What can we do to disrupt these chronic fraud victimization cycle? And we went through and we tried to identify different areas in each of those sections that we could offer some sort of a disruption. Different groups can play a role in different areas. So the first one, the situational factors, tackling chronic susceptibility, that out of all four of these, that is one of the most challenging ones. It's something that's difficult to do. If you're dealing with cognition, that's hard to straight up address, or the loss of a spouse. Those are things that are difficult to address. So we're really going to focus today on some of the three other ones. The trigger. So again, this is a way that we're looking to interrupt that in the moment attempt. So that phone call, what type of just-in-time education can we put in place to disrupt that trigger? Or what kind of structural interventions can we put in place so when that phone call comes in, the individual doesn't necessarily respond, or whatever that trigger may be, there's a pause in the moment for them to really analyze what's going on. The next one, the motivational section of the wheel. This is one, and whenever I'm talking with adult protective services or social workers, people in that advocacy role, this is one that I believe that they can really play a strong role in. Again, it's trying to fulfill that motivational need. And if you're an individual that is working with somebody who is a chronic fraud victim or has the potential of being a chronic fraud victim, by simply having a conversation with them, fulfilling that motivational need, making them feel needed and wanted through that conversation, that could be just a small action that could cause them to not go down the road of chronic fraud victimization. When that call comes in, they're not looking to meet that motivational need because they've already got it from social worker, from the victim advocate, from whoever it may be. So that's the motivational section. And then last, disrupting the ability. And again, this will be different ways that we could try and put buffers at the point of transaction. So working with financial institutions to increase awareness of red flags of financial fraud or exploitation so that they can try and stop the money before it goes out or put up controls, increase controls. Or working with individuals at convenience stores. So when a person comes in and is looking to get $2,000 of whatever gift card it may be to pay back the IRS back tax, that convenience store clerk can step in and say, you know what, this is the hallmark of a scam. You should not move forward with it. That would be disrupting the ability. Now, I mentioned before who FINRA was, and one of the roles that we play is that we do write and enforce rules. Back in 2018, we put 2 rules into place that really focuses on trying to disrupt that ability. And I'm just going to quickly talk about some of these. I think they're important rules, and people in different sectors, different jobs can actually play a role in helping financial institutions with this. So the first is a trusted contact. That is a rule that we put in place. It requires brokerage firms to make a reasonable effort to obtain a trusted contact on all retail accounts. Now, it does not require that the customer provide a trusted contact, but the firm has to make a reasonable effort to try and obtain it. And if somebody doesn't want to provide it, they can still open the account. But what a trusted contact is, it's a person, it's almost like an emergency contact that the brokerage firm can reach out to if they can't reach the customer, if they have concerns about fraud or exploitation. There's been instances where, you know, customers been on vacation, they're traveling somewhere, they don't have ready access to a phone or to their email, and a firm is trying to reach that customer and they can't do it. They could reach out to that trusted contact. The trusted contact could say, oh, so-and-so is traveling in the Mediterranean, they can't be reached, whatever it may be. Or if there is concern of exploitation, they can reach out to that trusted contact. Trusted contact is not a power of attorney. It's not somebody who has transactional authority on the account. It's not somebody who can place trades, who can get intimate account details. They can't find out that information. They really are that emergency contact. Now, the next rule that we put in place, it's a rule that provides brokerage firms with a safe harbor for placing a temporary hold or pause on transactions or withdrawals of funds. It's a temporary hold, and the firm can then take that time. So the money's not going out, the securities aren't being sold. This only applies if they believe there is some sort of fraud or exploitation occurring. But it provides them that moment in time where they can step back and really conduct an investigation. They can look into it further. And we all know that once that money leaves, once that money goes out, it's nearly impossible to get back. And if by some chance the money is able to be recovered, it's usually just a small fraction of the money that was sent. So it provides that moment in time where more investigation can occur. Adult protective services can be notified. Law enforcement can be notified. Now, this does expire, so it's not a blanket period of time. There is a certain time frame in which the firms are allowed to continue to hold the funds of the security. But that could be extended based on input from adult protective services, from law enforcement, from somebody who's the state securities regulator. If a brokerage firm gets a notice from adult protective services and says, you know, we are looking into these allegations, that could be enough for the brokerage firm to say, you know what, we're going to continue to hold. We're not going to let the funds go out. I know it's difficult with confidentiality, not being able to share details of the investigation, but by simply stating and informing a financial institution or a brokerage firm that it's something you're looking into, it can go a long way. I also have on the far side of the slide here our Securities Helpline for seniors. It's a program that FINRA operates. It's staffed by knowledgeable individuals who are readily available to answer questions, to point individuals into the right direction for financial resources. And if there are concerns of fraud, exploitation, bad conduct by an individual, they can take that information further and jumpstart an investigation into those allegations. So I would highly encourage you to write down that number if you're in a position that could leverage that.
Hey, Rob, I just checked the Q&A and there's some specific questions on this. Who specifically do the FINRA rules cover? And do you know what is the time period a temporary hold can stay in place?
Sure. So the rule covers brokerage firms that fall under FINRA's jurisdiction. So it does not apply to investment advisors that are individual investment advisors. It does not apply to banks. There has been a lot of talk about other financial institutions looking to create some sort of similar rule. Different states have put out similar rules as well, which would cover more so the investment advisor piece, but it's going to focus really on the brokerage firms, and that's who FINRA would regulate. Now, the temporary hold, trying to remember what the exact time frame. It just recently was updated in March, so it was a shorter time frame. It has been extended, but I don't remember off the top of my head what the new extension is. I think it's maybe up to 55 days, but it is a period of time that does expire. So if you're in a role where you are conducting an investigation, I strongly encourage you to open up those channels of communication as soon as possible with a financial institution. And again, don't necessarily have to share the details of your investigation, but just providing the information that it's something you're looking into can go a really, really long way. All right. So another way that you can disrupt the chronic fraud cycle here is focusing on education. So the question, can education prevent fraud? The simple answer is yes, it can. We found through a study we did with Better Business Bureau that prior knowledge of scams, how they work, how they operated, can reduce an individual's engagement in a potential fraudulent opportunity with scammers. And it can also reduce the amount of instances in which personal financial information is shared or losses occur. So through the study, we found that an individual who knows about scams, knows how they operate, knows the method that scammers use, 80% less likely to engage, 40% less likely to lose money or share personal information. So it really does demonstrate that education can play a significant role in disrupting this, not only the chronic fraud cycle, but fraud in general. So if you ever have an opportunity, the more we can talk about scams, talk about what's out there, what the red flags are, how they operate, and inform consumers, the better off they're going to be able to identify these type of fraudulent activities and opportunities and stop them in its tracks. So trauma-informed response, this is a slide that we would just really like to include because it's such an important reminder for individuals who deal with victims of financial fraud. So trauma-informed response, a lot of times you're going to see it more in physical abuse type cases or violent crimes, but the same concept, the same idea and thought process really does apply to individuals that are victimized by financial fraud. So some of these important reminders are to understand and assume that the individual is experiencing some sort of trauma or there's some sort of trauma history. Financial fraud can be traumatic, and it is something that individuals handle in different ways. Everybody approaches trauma differently, but it's important to remember by sitting an individual down and interrogating them, asking them questions, that could cause them to be re-victimized, that could cause them to relive that experience. So the way that we use our words and the way that we approach those situations, it's important to get the information, but the way that we go about doing it is also extremely important. So taking more of that soft eye approach, letting the individual explain on their terms as opposed to these pointed questions that you might have in more of an interrogation technique. Understanding again that trauma can affect people's perception of a situation. It can impact their trust. It can impact the willingness to cooperate. So keeping that in the back of your mind is important. Ways that we can emphasize physical, psychological, and emotional safety is also another great tactic, as is creating opportunities for victims to try and rebuild that sense of control. So if an individual is a victim of identity theft, something along those lines, by giving the individual tasks to go out and complete, reaching out to the credit bureaus, that can be a way for them to regain control and empower them to move forward. So a small task that you can put on the victim to be able to begin taking back some of that control would be a great step to take. Kathy,
Thanks,
talk
Rob.
about the role that we can take.
Yeah, so I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes or so talking about how we talk about financial fraud victims and why we believe we as a society need to change that. And I know for a lot of you who are victim advocates, this is going to be preaching to the choir, but maybe not so much in the context of victims of financial fraud. So let's go ahead and move on to that next slide. So I think you all know, when you have a friend or somebody you know that has experienced a violent crime, a property crime, we react the way we should react, right? Oh, that poor person, that poor family, I'll send them over a lasagna. Like we want to help them. We want to care. We want to show that we care. But when we know someone who has fallen victim to a scam, this is how we react. You got duped by that? That's the oldest trick in the book. Or how could you have fallen for that? Or, oh, you'd have to be an idiot. Or how much money did you give them? Very, very different, right? And what that produces is a feeling in the victim that they're guilty. I can't believe I fell for this. How could I be so stupid? And we don't really know the chicken and the egg here. Do we blame victims so victims blame themselves? Or does it start out as victims feeling shame? And so we grow that into sort of a societal narrative? Not sure, not even sure it matters. It's just what happens. So AARP does a lot of interacting online. And here's just some examples of when you're talking to people about fraud and fraud victimization. Here are just 3 people who had interesting thoughts about victims. The first one, I cannot fathom the level of gullibility it would take for someone to send money to someone they never met. Or very sad, but really, these women need their heads screwed on properly. And then there's my favorite, good God, where has common sense gone? I know people are lonely, hell, I'm lonely, but I'm not stupid. You get the theme here. But it's not just how we talk about it, it's how the media represent this. Here's 2 different headlines, 2 different crimes. The top one is a suspect was busted for robbing an 80-year-old man. You obviously see the criminal and the crime in that headline. But look at that second headline, Hillsborough woman bilked out of $28,950. Well, do you see a crime or the criminal in that? Not really, right? I mean, maybe it's tucked in there somewhere. But what we're saying here, what this reporter is saying, that this woman was bilked. She fell for it. She got scammed. She got tricked. And that lays blame on the person for falling victim when someone intentionally targeted that person for this crime. all of this serves to give us what one of my colleagues, who I consider a mentor, his name is Doug Shadell out of the Washington State AARP office, if any of you know him, this illusion of it can't happen to us, right? This illusion of invincibility, because if we can find a fault in that victim for losing all the money he or she lost or losing their sensitive information, then we can just kind of put it aside, sort of put it in a corner and say, that's never going to happen to us. And I would submit also that there's some ageism at play there, because you saw that poll. So many people just presume that fraud only happens to old people. And they think that because it's, they're not tech savvy, or they have cognitive decline, or, they're nicer than other generations. It's none of that. And what's really important to understand is there's this tactic, and we mentioned it earlier about getting someone into an emotional state. These criminal scammers, since time immemorial, have known that if you can get a target under some like major heightened emotional response, what they call being under the ether, like fear or excitement, I won the lottery and a car, or it could be the development over time of a deep love interest, right? If they can get you up there in that heightened emotional state in the ether, you have a real tough time accessing logical thinking. They know that, and that's why they start with the emotional trigger, because if they can succeed with that, then they can succeed with stealing money or sensitive information. And understand, this isn't just some guy in his mom's basement making one phone call after the other or lurking on social media sites. These are by and large transnational criminal enterprises who have people working in the United States for them to launder their money and get it back to them. They are big businesses, and they have buildings, they have employees, they have programs where employees can win bonuses for, taking in as the most amount of money. And they have scripts, they know the playbook, and that's why they're so successful. Rob.
So this is the all too human toll that financial fraud can have on individuals. We know that billions of dollars are lost. And I mentioned it before, there's often very little chance of restitution. Once that money's gone, it's gone. We also know that nearly 2/3 of victims, they report experiencing at least some serious health or emotional impact. Again, kind of goes back to that trauma-informed response that individuals should take. But people they experience, when they are victims of financial fraud, they experience high levels of stress or anxiety, difficulty sleeping. These are all costs of financial fraud that isn't monetary. And when we talk about financial fraud, a lot of times we gravitate towards what was the dollar amount. But it's so important to remember that individuals are experiencing these emotional tolls as well. And that's the non-financial cost of fraud. And we also know that, unfortunately, thousands of individuals die by suicide, often at the result of losing money or being victimized by different types of scams or exploitation.
What if we as a society could just change the whole narrative here? Let's not focus on something the victim did wrong or didn't do right or didn't know. And let's focus on that perpetrator. What if we said falling victim is not your fault? It's the fault of the criminal who perpetrated this crime. I'm sorry you've had to endure this. What if we said, instead of saying, I can't believe you got duped or tricked or scammed or you fell for it, how about saying, it's not your fault? Scammers are good at what they do. You are a crime victim. We do know that there's a lack of understanding in the law enforcement community quite often that fraud is a crime. It can be a civil matter, but it's also a crime. And a lot of victims are dismissed when they try to file a report with the police, because the police will say, well, either you willingly gave them money, or that's not a crime, that's a civil matter. And that's just not not accurate. But you can see the difference here, right? When you're calling someone saying someone got duped or they got scammed or they fell for it, it implies that they did something wrong and it makes them feel shame. But on the other side, when we're, focusing on the individual as a victim of a crime, we're showing empathy and empowering that victim. And so it's really not just a game of semantics. And I think so many of you on this call get this, but we just want to run through what we believe could be the major impacts of changing this narrative. First of all, we believe that instead of hiding in shame, more victims of these crimes would report. They get mad, they want to do something about it. We have a severe underreporting problem here, and we think this would help to solve that. Family relationships, you all have probably seen it yourself, get destroyed, especially in the cases of chronic victimization when it's an older adult. We believe if those families were to come to the issue with the understanding of the parent being a victim of a targeted crime versus having done something, quote, stupid, we would protect those family relationships. And I had mentioned before, but we believe that more police officers would be equipped with the knowledge that, yep, these are crimes, and they should at least take the report, if not investigate. We think prosecutors would take on more cases, fully understanding that this is a crime that can be solved and people can be put in jail, and they're put in jail every day. And we need to do a whole lot more of that. And we also think policymakers might act. Rob has said several times, if you lose money to a scam, by and large, that's it. You're not getting that money back in most cases. Well, maybe policymakers would get the impact of these billions and billions of dollars leaving our economy and leaving the nest eggs of so many individuals, and maybe, I don't know, figure out how to set up a restitution fund or something like that. And finally, those billions of dollars would not leave our economy to go fund transnational criminal enterprises, and we would all be the better for it. And so in the end, if this resonates with you, be the change. Adopt the language that doesn't blame. Acknowledge the sophistication of the crime and the criminal and the playbook that they all know that works so well. Respond to victims with that empathy, with that concern, help them to report the crime. If you're on LinkedIn, I'd love to meet you there. I'm often talking about this issue with hashtag not the victim's fault. Doesn't quite flow off the tongue, so I might want to do something a little shorter next time, but I would love to hear from you. We can continue the conversation.
Perfect. So now we're just going to quickly cover a couple different resources that are out there for you all before we get into any questions that might be hanging out there. So Finra Foundation and FINRA, we offer a lot of different resources. There's 2 different websites. Both of these are worth writing down. The first one we'll talk about, it's the FINRA Foundation website. This is going to be more of our business to business type of information. Our research you'll find there are different items that might be helpful if you're doing outreach or you're going out into the community. The finrafoundation.org/fraudfighter is the direct URL that you can go to. We have a taking action guide that we created with the National Center of Victims of Crime. And you might have heard Rachel and I talking about it at other webinars or other engagements. It's a fantastic guide for advocates who are assisting victims of financial fraud. Provides a lot of different helpful information. We also have a checklist for different types of financial frauds, which again, helping empower those victims. Those checklists can be a great starting point. We have free information available as well that you can order. We'll ship it to you for free in the quantities that you need. So if you are doing outreach events, we can ship you the taking action guides. We can ship you some of the other financial literature that we have talking about frauds, talking about scams, those types of things. So again, finrafoundation.org/fraudfighter. Broker check is a great tool to leverage. I didn't talk about it today, but if you are looking for information on a brokerage firm or an employee of a brokerage firm, BrokerCheck is a free tool that individuals can use to look up those individuals. So if you want to see the disciplinary history of a person, you want to see how long they've been in the industry, you can find all that through BrokerCheck. Our FINRA.org website, there is a section that's dedicated directly for investors. You can find a lot of really helpful information there as well, including information on BrokerCheck. I mentioned our Securities Helpline previously, but again, here's the number. It's 844-574-3577. You do not have to be a senior to call. You do not have to be the individual that's experiencing the concern. We get calls from brokerage firms. We get calls from advocates. We get calls from concerned family members. So anybody can leverage that toll-free option. So a lot of great resources. Again, FINRAFoundation.org/fraudfighter and FINRA.org. And we're not the only ones. Kathy
Sorry.
has some resources as well.
Yeah, I was on mute. So I want to talk about some resources, but I neglected to mention that the victim blaming narrative change activity, we are producing another research paper that Finra Foundation and AARP did together with that same consulting firm. We should be getting it out early to mid-July at the latest. And Rachel, we'll send you the link so you can send it out. So it's some really fascinating reading, and we hope that we can get people to sort of partner with us and look at their own the publications, whatever they have in writing, to double check, are we blaming the victim that way? Just sort of changing the way we look at the stuff and talk about it. The Fraud Watch Network, as I mentioned earlier, we have a great website, lots of good educational information. We have what's called a fraud resource center there, 80 or so tip sheets of common scams. Our helpline is available to anybody. You don't have to be of any age or any membership status. 877-908-3360. Talk to trained fraud specialists to report a scam, to answer a question if you're not sure if something is legitimate, or for help for victims and their families. And lastly, we have a program we just launched last year, and it's supporting victims to try to help them overcome the emotional impact of their experience. If you go to aarp.org/fraud support, you can learn more about it. Please share that and our helpline number far and wide. And it is an online Zoom program, like maybe half a dozen people get on with a trained peer, and they have the conversation and help victims understand they're not alone and it's not their fault. And 2A1, it's been very impactful.
This is our contact information. So if anybody wants to reach out to us directly through email, feel free to do so. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your thoughts, any inputs you have. I know Kathy mentioned LinkedIn. I think she shared her LinkedIn information. I'm on there as well. More than welcome to connect through LinkedIn. And Rachel, looks like we might have some questions.
Yes, we do. Hold on just a second. It looks like Kathy, your email, your LinkedIn didn't get to everyone, so I just put that back in the Slack. Our chat. Our first question is: can you talk about data breach accountability when fraud happens, when it's by a third party?
Data breach accountability in terms of the organization that was breached? Would I assume that?
Yeah, I think so. We didn't get any more information than that.
I think that's a space that doesn't have much by way of oversight or regulation. Most companies, when they're breached, will let the people affected know and know what was exposed, and they'll offer free credit monitoring. The reality is, unfortunately, that all of our data are out there. It's just so easy to steal and to create either synthetic identities or user identities to open accounts in our name. There are ways you can protect against that, working with the credit bureaus to freeze your credit so nobody can open an account in your name, making sure you use unique passwords for every account, financial and other. Scammers are really good. Within minutes, they can crack most of our passwords, and 70% of us are still using the same or similar passwords across things. And, I think that it just pays to be aware of what's happening. And importantly, when you learn of a new scam or, something happened in the identity fraud space, pass it on, share it, talk to people about it, because, Rob said, you're so much less likely to engage with the scam to begin with if you know about it.
Awesome, thanks. Our second question is, can you discuss about victims of ransom on those who have received threats from scammers threatening personal information would be released if they do not send money?
Yeah, that was actually even more common a couple of years ago than I think it is now. It's still out there, but those same criminals have realized they can make a ton more money by doing it, by targeting businesses. So that is a huge issue in the business industry right now, business world. It's still out there. I mean, my 21-year-old daughter just got one of those. It happens. I don't know of a case where somebody actually was in your system and could lock it up until you paid your ransom. So if for example, let's say you get a pop-up on your device that says we're locking your system and you have to pay X in Bitcoin, just go out of that browser, and that typically gets rid of it. And if you think there's concern, then, talk to someone who you trust with technology to see if there's anything on your computer. So by and large, it's criminals that have bought data on the dark web that has exposed your email address and maybe an old password, and they'll use that information to make it sound like they actually have more information on you than they do. And just ignore those and report them to the Federal Trade Commission or to the helpline that we have, because we report to the Federal Trade Commission.
Reporting it's such an important mechanism to take, even if you, like Kathy said, you close out your browser and it's gone. You don't have to worry about it anymore. Making that report is really an important step to take. It's also important to remember that to scammers, these are numbers games. So the more people that they can reach out to, the more likely one person will potentially respond. So not to say that they're all bluffing, but there could be a lot of that's occurring where the scammer is reaching out to so many people, just hoping that one person is going to say, oh no, I don't want that information out there, and send the money. Because again, it's a numbers game. It costs very little for them to send out these mass blasts to individuals, again, in the hope that one person is going to respond. So keep that in mind. And of course, report. If there are concerns that you have, looping in law enforcement can be a step that you can take. The FBI, they have their IC3 database. You can report it there as well. Any type of internet related crime or concern, you can report to IC3, which is the FBI's website.
Wonderful. So we've got time for maybe one or two last questions. I'm going to combine two questions. It sounds like folks are asking for the materials, the FINRA Securities Helpline for Senior info cards. Can they order those? And then someone else asked, does the material and do the helplines provide services in Spanish or other languages?
So I'll quickly say that the portal that I mentioned before, where you can order information, so FINRA.org or FINRAFoundation.org/fraudfighter, there is an online portal. You can go directly into that, and you can have those senior helpline cards sent directly to you in the quantity that fits your need. So yes, those materials, they are available, as are a whole bunch of other materials to be sent to you for free. In terms of having information in other languages, we do have some of our articles written in Spanish. The senior helpline, they do have individuals that speak different languages as well. And I know, Kathy, I think you all have services as well to support those that speak languages other than English.
Yeah, I think we have a system that helps us with 200 and some languages. So we're covered there on the helpline.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate you all so much for joining us today. There were some great questions and a few last minute questions, so feel free to reach out to our presenters today. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, so you will get it at the in the next few weeks with the materials, the PDF, and an evaluation. So be on the lookout for that. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us at the National Center for Victims of Crime. We host these webinars quite often with FINRA, and we bring in special guests like Kathy. So if you are interested in getting our information to find out more about our webinars, feel free to reach out to us. As always, thank you so much for the work that each one of you do every day to support victims of crime. And if you need anything, you know where to find us. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hey, Rob. Bye, Rachel.